Well, good afternoon, boys and girls. Welcome to another scintillating, didactic, and provocative business and its environment presentation. Well, we're looking at a couple of things today. The first one being business in politics. Oh, yes, business and politics. Oh, my. So, what's the story about business in politics? Most people would initially think at first blush, wow, business shouldn't be involved in politics. Well, maybe by the end of our presentation, you may think otherwise. So clearly, we know that our legal system is based on our Constitution, and certainly our Constitution affects business. And being three parts of the government, the executive, the legislative, the judicial parts, these branches certainly provide opportunities for business to influence the government at a variety of different levels. Now, that probably isn't news to you, but how about the news going back to the time of the conclusion of the Revolutionary War in 1783? Well, we had 13 new states, and these new states had their own currency and their own taxes, and they were all, independent. And there was this weak central government that was governed by what we simply referred to as the Articles of Confederation. Well, 4 years later of living and operating under this arrangement, the 13 states realized that the Articles of Confederation, this confederation of states, wasn't working out very well for business. Well, let me get specific. So let's assume for the moment we've got George Washington in down there in Alexandria, Virginia. And of course, George Washington, being an agribusinessman, he is growing wheat and corn and other types of agricultural products. Well, assume for the moment he's got buyers in New York that want to buy his grain, his corn, his wheat. So he loads them up in his wagon, and he motors on up from Virginia to, let's say, Pennsylvania. And he gets to the border in Pennsylvania. And of course, they have a toll tax that George Washington's business people who are driving his wagons are going to have to pay. But of course, they've got Virginia currency, not Pennsylvania currency, so they got to do some type of an exchange, right? They got to pay this toll tax. Well, then they, motor on up into New Jersey. And now New Jersey greets them at the border, and they want to have their toll tax paid in New Jersey currency. So now they got to figure out how to convert Virginia currency into currency for New Jersey. And then eventually, hopefully, the grain, the wheat, the corn get to New York. But of course, what happens in New York? Well, they want to do business in New York currency, right? So you're beginning to get a picture of, oh my, this sounds complicated and not very efficient, not very effective. And so after 4 years of trying to make this work, the 13 states send representatives to Philadelphia for a little convention, a constitutional convention. Now, take a look at who was at the Constitutional Convention. Alexander Hamilton, banker from New York. John Adams, business lawyer from Massachusetts. James Madison, agribusinessman from Virginia. John Jay, banker from New York. And so if you take a look very carefully, you'll see Benjamin Franklin, who was a publisher, an inventor, and a businessman from Pennsylvania, from Philadelphia. And so if you take a look at all of the attendees and all the delegates to the Constitutional Convention, they all had one thing in common. What do you think that one thing was? Yep, they were all businessmen. How about that? Everybody, all the delegates to the convention were businessmen. So they wanted to create a constitutional system where business, being obviously the lifeblood of the economy and the nation, the new nation, could work. And so, for example, in Article 1 of the Constitution, addressing the legislative branch, what is Congress empowered to do in Section 8 there? Pass laws affecting commerce, right? Affecting commerce, because commerce was obviously an important subject for the delegates. And so our system, it very much has had a business influence from its very beginning. Now, our Constitution, as it is set up, allows federal law to preempt state law. So on behalf of the entire nation, the federal government enacts law, and state law cannot conflict with it. Now, as I mentioned, there are, of course, with these three branches, opportunities for business to affect the three branches. So nothing new about that in our historical system. But right to the present day, of course, the founders had created the Constitution, had drafted it, so that no one branch of the government could impose its will unilaterally on the other. So if the executive branch wants to spend money on something, well, guess what? It doesn't have the legal authority or the constitutional authority to appropriate funds. Under Article 1 of the Constitution, only the legislative branch can appropriate funds. Well, who decides what is constitutional and what is not constitutional? Not the executive branch, not the legislative branch. That's left to the judicial branch to do. So our founding fathers set up a constitutional system that wasn't particularly efficient, but it was a beginning of checks and balances to see that no one branch all by itself could impose its will on the other. So remember that the colonists, the new Americans, had unloaded one British tyrant, and they were very reluctant to create a new one. So these are the types of authorities that were put into place by the Constitution when it was finally ratified in 1789. Now, there was a deal struck in order to get the Constitution ratified. And James Madison was actually the broker for the deal, because not all, but some of the states wanted protections against the government listed in the body of the Constitution itself. A number of constitutional representatives, delegates, didn't want to fool with amending the Constitution before all of the 13 states voted on it. So a promise was made, an agreement was made that a set of amendments would be created subsequent to enactment of the Constitution itself, what became known as the Bill of Rights. The first 10 amendments were actually enacted after the main Constitution was ratified. The whole point of the exercise was, well, let's get the big kahuna done first, and then we'll take care of these protections afterwards. And that's what happened. What about business? Well, business certainly plays a role in constitutional operations, as we're going to see. And yeah, it's true that the economic elite wrote and ratified the Constitution. So we know women couldn't vote back in those days. In a number of states, non-property holders could not vote. Certainly, we know minorities couldn't, vote. And so, yeah, we had a select few that chose on behalf of us all. But look how it's worked out in a fairly satisfactory manner. Of course, as the years go by, we industrialize and come the Civil War, and war always seems to fire up the economy. We had business grow and go, as we have seen in our previous sessions involving J.P. Morgan and John Rockefeller and other uh, business people of that age who in the 19th century created enormous empires. Well, of course, the late 19th century, as you have read, led to not a small degree of corruption. And this, of course, to every action, there's a reaction, brought about the Antitrust Act of 1890 and other uh, pieces of legislation to try and reduce the power of business and its arbitrary and capricious conduct. Of course, we all know what happened in October of 1929, and the Depression certainly brought into power not only President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, but of course, he proposed legislation to Congress like the Securities and Exchange Act of 1933 and 1934, among other many, many laws. The whole point being to reform the economy and to inject restraint over, business. The 1950s, obviously post World War II, brought about tremendous economic growth. Right on up into the social movements of the 1960s, where we now saw business getting attacked by non-governmental organizations, social movements, the Greens, the Sierra Club, lots of organizations that were interested in trying to see business greater regulated. So we find today that business, of course, is the basis for our economy. And I think it's true that business is the engine of democracy. And we know that when business doesn't do well, the rest of the country catches pneumonia, right? And so the question arises, well, how does business influence government? And is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, my friend Ralph Nader, who founded Public Citizen and Consumer Advocate and other public interest groups, his position is that, business corporations are the most pernicious entities known to man. Well, it is true that business is represented in Washington. Every business is represented. So we got the American Medical Association representing the medical community, the American Bar Association representing lawyers. We've got the AFL-CIO representing, labor. We've got the Chamber of Commerce, obviously, representing a lot of different businesses. And so we have, more than 6,000 trade associations out there representing business to the government. Well, everybody seems to be represented except Joe Q. Citizen. So who represents Joe Q. Citizen? Interesting question, right? Well, we're going to see that there are a number of NGOs, non-governmental organizations that have arisen over the years to represent the public interest. We'll talk more about lobbying in just a moment, but it's an important function that we'll go into greater detail on. But it is poignant to note that virtually every significant trade association has an office in Washington, D.C. Why? To watch the government. To watch the government. It was Thomas Jefferson who observed that while Congress is in session, the Republic is not safe. Well, perhaps meant facetiously, but that is one of the reasons why all these organizations have offices in Washington to watch the government and obviously to communicate with it. And so we're going to talk about that in greater detail. So an important function of these organizations, these lobbying groups, is to certainly represent, and that's the operative term, the views of their members in their organization. So let's take, for example, AFL-CIO represents labor. And so labor obviously has a voice that is exercised by the AFL-CIO. Now, what do? What do these lobbyists actually do on behalf of the AFL-CIO? Well, they provide lawmakers technical information. Now, if you think senators and congressmen have, staffs of several hundred people that enable them to stay on top of governmental operations and all proposed legislation, no, that's not true. They don't. They have small staffs, and so they rely upon lobbyists to provide them technical information about the interests of their particular group. So, for example, here in South Dakota, and it's a gorgeous day here in South Dakota, we've got the students out there on their beach towels underneath our palm trees here at USD. Gorgeous day, gorgeous day. But I've got my snow hat on because I hear we've got a big blizzard headed our way, but nevertheless, I'm ready. I'm ready. So lobbyists certainly provide, so let's take, for example, South Dakota, and certainly ethanol and agribusiness are number 1 and 2, economic issues here. And so how do congressmen and senators learn about agricultural or ethanol issues? Well, our lobbying associations representing those entities provide information to them on that. Now, lobbyists certainly do research, and of course, while the research obviously comes from a particular perspective, lobbyists are very careful not to mislead or lie to legislators, because if you do lie or mislead to a legislator, what are the chances they'll ever talk to you again? So they certainly talk to discuss with the legislators pending legislation, pro and con, their particular organization's interests. They do host what are called fundraising receptions. The milk of politics, of course, is money. Every congressman and senator has got to raise X thousands of dollars each and every day in order to run for re-election. That's the first rule in politics, is re-election. And so how do they get this money? Well, you get invited to a reception. The host organization, foots the bill for the drinks and for the food, but the people that attend are expected to bring donations to the congressman or a senator. And it's an opportunity for them certainly to talk about issues that are of mutual concern. Now, lobbyists are regulated, which we'll see to a minor extent, because as we'll see, it's more regulatory and procedural regulations, but we'll talk about money in just a moment. But the First Amendment protects, as you might think, First Amendment lobbying activities. Now, is it lawful for a lobbyist to bribe a congressman or senator? I think that's an intuitively interesting question that would derive the answer absolutely not. And it's unlawful for a lobbyist or anybody for that matter to promise a gratuity to a congressman or senator in exchange for a vote on a particular piece of legislation. So they have to, lobbyists and legislators have to avoid illegal, that is, unlawful gratuities or the exchange of gratuities for an official action. So, can congressmen accept free rides on airplanes and attendance at athletic events? Yes, they can to a certain extent, but there are limits. And of course, they have to make reports on accepting gratuities from lobbyists and other parties. Now, I will tell you from personal experience of having worked with both lobbyists and legislators when I was in Washington, D.C. for 5 years. Lobbyists hate, they really do, hate having to make campaign donations. I mean, let's face it, it sounds like, feels like, it's a sleazy business. And believe it or not, legislators absolutely hate soliciting campaign contributions, but it is what it is. It is an endemic part of political and legislative life. If you want to get reelected, you got to raise a gazillion dollars. Well, who's going to give you that money? Probably not going to be USD professors. And so they've got to get that money from the lobbyists. Now, lobbyists are quick to point out that when they give money, what they are getting for their money is access to the legislator. Now, the legislator is quick to say, look, I can't sell my vote. That's unlawful. What the money does is certainly provides access. That I'm certainly going to give time to listen to and communicate with donors who donate to my reelection campaign. There is a federal law known as FECA, the Federal Election Campaign Act, that set up a regulatory framework that is supposed to limit contributions and expenditures to legislators. However, it subsequently failed to really limit campaign spending in any degree. And we are, in fact, seeing each election cycle more money spent than the previous one. The Supreme Court case Buckley v. Vallejo invalidated the FECA statute's expenditure limits, but its contribution limits have continued in force. We'll talk more about those in a moment. So we've certainly seen the growth of interest groups over the years, including business groups like the Chamber of Commerce, right? Even the NRA, which is talked about frequently right now. And so that has all led to the growth in campaign contributions. But as we're going to see, business has found workarounds. We call them workarounds around the federal law's limits and prohibitions on corporate giving. So let's look at some of the workarounds that provide funds to legislators. PACs, you've all heard of PACs, right? PACs can be set up by companies. They can be funded by voluntary employee contributions. PACs themselves can legally give to federal candidates, whereas their sponsoring companies cannot. So if you will, the PACs somewhat launder the money before it goes to the candidates. Soft money are contributions that are not regulated by FECA. It permits corporations, businesses, to give unlimited amounts of soft money to political party committees. The money is then used to influence federal elections. primarily with ads that you see on television promoting certain candidates, but avoiding specific language to defeat those candidates. That's a really fine line, as you might imagine. In 2002, Congress, believe it or not, enacted the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act, trying to close the soft money loophole. The law prohibited corporations from giving soft money to national political party committees, and even prohibited corporations from funding issue ads if they were broadcast 30 days before primaries or 60 days before general elections. It even raised the limits for individuals and allowed for adjustments for inflation. But then the Supreme Court got involved in 2010 in the infamous Citizens United case, in which the Supreme Court struck down that 2002 prohibition against corporate funding of issue ads and federal election campaigns, prohibition based on a violation of the First Amendment free speech rights of business. Yes, businesses have First Amendment free speech rights. So, do corporations now have a variety of ways to inject money into elections? They do, certainly with PACs, right? Individual contributions by executives. Bundling is where you've got, if you will, one person who goes around and collects money from executives, soliciting contributions for a particular candidate, and then bundles them together and passes them on to the candidate. Contributions to 501c3, or not C3, but C groups, or tax-exempt organizations that represent business interests. These can provide campaign funds as well. Contributions by IRS Section 527 groups or committees organized under the tax codes to engage in political activities like the Republican Party or the Democratic National Party. So these are all the types of things that are, if you will, sources of businesses' influence into governmental affairs, certainly on the legislation side. So that serves as a foundation for talking about our next chapter, which is regulating business. So we've just covered how business influences the legislative branch in a significant way. Well, why does business want to influence the legislative branch? Well, the legislative branch, as we're going to see, enacts laws that certainly affect business. So we ask the question, why do we need government regulation of business to start with? Interesting question. Why do we need government regulation of business? Now, currently, there's a conversation ongoing in Washington about the need to deregulate governmental regulations on business. Okay, you can probably get a lot of folks excited about doing that, but the question then becomes, how far should you go? Should we get rid of all government regulations? Well, Thomas Jefferson observed, the government should only do for the people the things that the people cannot do for themselves. So let's reflect, for example, on what happened on 9/11. If we had no Federal Aeronautics Administration, but instead all 50 states regulating their own airspace, how would all aircraft nationwide, grounding after the attack occur? The FAA was able to get every commercial and private plane in the air down at an airport within 60 minutes after the last plane crashed. Now, that's quite a feat. If all 50 states govern their airspace, how long would that have taken? a long time, I bet. And so there's an example of why we need a Federal Aeronautics Administration to govern air traffic. After the BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, how would the cleanup and investigation be undertaken if we didn't have the Environmental Protection Agency? How would that happen? Would South Dakota be involved in that? Would New Mexico be involved in that? So you can see the confusion that would erupt by having too many hands in the pot as opposed to just one federal hand. So without the Environmental Protection Act, how would air, water, and toxic waste be handled? What about the Exxon Valdez spill? So we would all have to confess, right, that we wouldn't be much of a match against airlines or business enterprises. Hence, we need governmental regulation, but the question remains, so how much? Well, trying to answer the question, geez, do we really need government regulation of the private sector? There are a couple of legitimate answers that I think that address that. The first is, look, markets inherently have market flaws, right? Like natural monopolies, destructive competition, externalities or costs of production, such as pollution, and also inadequate information that reduces the efficient operation of markets. A second point here is, look, we need social and political objectives for regulation to ensure the production of socially desirable goods. So, for example, tobacco products, don't we need those to be regulated for the public health and safety, to encourage socially desirable production methods? OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Act, sets up standards by which production must be undertaken that require steel-toed boots and safety glasses and fire retardant overalls and whatnot for a number of manufacturing enterprises. Why is that a bad thing? I don't think it is. I think it's a good thing. Certainly to resolve national and global problems that individuals can't manage, like NAFTA, that is an ongoing conversation right now. And then certainly it's true to benefit special interests that have political strength to pressure lawmakers for favorable laws and rules, like ethanol, right? South Dakota loves ethanol. New Mexico doesn't love ethanol. So it's true that regulation, as our nation's economy has evolved, certainly has grown as well. So how does federal regulation originate? Well, it actually starts with a bill that is passed by both houses of Congress and signed normally by the president. So let's take, for example, the Environmental Protection Act. So the Environmental Protection Act of the late 1970s not only set up some regulatory standards, it also set up the EPA agency. And what was the purpose of the agency? Well, the purpose of the agency was to carry out the purpose of the act itself. Now, there are independent commissions like the Securities and Exchange Commission, for example, or the Federal Aeronautics Administration, the Federal Trade Commission. There are lots of independent regulatory commissions. Now, why do we call them independent commissions? Like the SEC? Well, they're not under any of the three branches of government. They were created by Congress, if you will, to be self-running. Congress gave them a mission in their statute, which we will refer to as an enabling statute. It enables the agency to carry out the legislative purpose that Congress has enacted. Now, independent commissions are different from executive agencies because executive agencies come under the executive branch. and are run by a single administrator, like the Office of the Bureau of the Budget. Now, statutes can be specific or general in nature, and so they're all over the place. Some of them may be vague, which obviously gives agencies a lot of discretion. Agencies issue rules, like the Internal Revenue Service, for example, issues rules, and so does the EPA and lots of other independent commissions. Certainly the SEC is another example. They issue rules explaining how the law is going to be enforced by that agency. So the agency is trying to carry out the legislative intent that is in the bill, the statute that Congress enacted, setting up the agency for that express purpose. Now, rulemaking functions go on every day in virtually every governmental agency. Executive agencies, as distinguished from independent agencies, have to submit their proposed rules to the White House for approval. And if the proposed rule may affect the economy in the amount of $100 million or more, then the agency that's proposing the rule needs to prepare a report explaining its full cost-benefit analysis. Now, independent commissions, since they don't work for the executive branch, don't have to comply with that. But all proposed agency rules are required by law, under the Administrative Procedures Act, to be printed in a daily government publication. Believe it or not, the federal government has its own newspaper. How many did you know that? It's called the Federal Register. The Federal Register contains all of the proposed rules that different governmental agencies, the independent commissions, and the executive agencies are proposing. Now, assuming for the moment that the rules become final, where you can find them is in what's called the CFR, the Code of Federal Regulation. And you can go online, just type in Code of Federal Regulations, and there's an index. So let's take, for example, my good old friends at the Department of Defense. All of their statutes involving the Department of Defense come under Title 10 of the United States Code. So if you want to find out where are federal regulations involving the Department of Defense, you would look under 10 CFR. So Title 10, Chapter 10 of the Code of Federal Regulations will mirror and have in detail federal regulations involving the Department of Defense. And so it is with Title 5 and so forth and so on. And so it's easy to find the federal regulations. Just find the statutory identifier. What's the number? Title 5 would be civil service. So under 5 CFR, you're going to find all the civil service regulations. Okay. About the only, well, there are a couple of ways that Congress does exercise some degree of control over regulators. One certainly is by holding hearings, and you've seen those on C-SPAN, where they're conducting hearings, bringing in agencies and asking, agency leaders and directors and commissioners, questions. They also have the Congressional Review Act that gives them the ability to block major new rules from going into effect if both houses of Congress pass a resolution of disapproval within, I think it's 90 days of the rule becoming final. And there's certainly the judicial system. The federal courts have the power to review agency decisions when cases are brought by regulated parties. So a good example would be the Obama administration's coal plant regulatory restrictions. You recall they couldn't get those passed through Congress, and so by executive order, the EPA issued a rule, a regulation that clamped down and applied significant restrictions to coal plant emissions. Well, subsequently, the coal plant owners appealed to the judicial system. It went up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, yes, it's true. The executive branch has overreached, and they need legislative authority. Executive authority is insufficient in order to impose these rules on the coal plant industry. So we do have the judicial branch striking down agency actions that are deemed to be arbitrary, capricious, or unconstitutional, or beyond the agency jurisdiction, or unsupported by evidence. Now, what do we mean by evidence? Agencies are required to do a benefit and cost analysis before they issue regulations. And if there isn't a benefit, then obviously there's going to be an insufficient legal basis for the regulation coming into existence. Certainly, compliance costs can be significant. The Securities and Exchange Commission certainly imposed a significant amount of costs on the securities industry. But of course, there are benefits too. Certainly, protection of the public. So we saw when Congress enacted the Dodd-Frank Act, empowering a number of agencies to, like the FDIC and the Fed and others, to regulate the banking industry in a more significant way. Clearly, what happened in 2008 brought about enactment of Dodd-Frank, and again, for the benefit of protecting the public from the too big to fail situations of 2008. It is true when we look at business regulation internationally that we'll see that in poor countries, there's a tendency to go overboard in terms of heavier regulation on business, and that leads to corruption and lower productivity. More developed countries, certainly like the European Union and ourselves, there is less regulation compared to some of these developing countries. So, hopefully you read about the Metrolink train accident in preparation for today. So what was this all about? So we had a commuter train near Los Angeles that ended up getting in an accident where 24 passengers and the engineer on the train were killed. So what was the cause of the accident? Well, the cause of the accident was the engineer wasn't paying attention. He was looking at his cell phone, of all things. Well, 2 U.S. senators pushed through a bill that Congress enacted requiring the acquisition, that is the purchase, of expensive equipment to automatically control trains. So that had this equipment been installed in this train, without the engineer doing anything, the train would have automatically stopped at the red light instead of going through it. But the reality in this particular case was that the actual safety cost was exceeded its benefit under the circumstances. In other words, it cost more to impose this new electronic guidance system than it did in terms of saving lives. And so that, raises some interesting questions. So the cost exceeded the benefit. So would greater oversight have perhaps been more appropriate and more cost effective? Installing audio and video equipment, would that in the locomotive cabs, would that have been more cost effective than installing this multi-million-dollar train guidance control system? Interesting questions that need to be asked in a cost-benefit analysis. But you can see how politics can intervene. Now, in its cost-benefit analysis, the Federal Railroad Administration valued a life, and there were, 24 lost in the accident, plus the engineer. They valued a statistical life at $6 million. Now, clearly, if you're going to do an economic cost-benefit analysis, you have to assign some value to a human life, right? And so using a basket of economic studies, they came up with a $6 million valuation. Now, you're probably thinking, that's ridiculous. Human life is priceless. Well, I think we can agree on that. But for the purpose of doing a economic analysis, you're going to have to assign some value based on some factor in order to conduct a cost-benefit analysis. Were there other more inexpensive ways to deal with this? I think that's the argument of the authors, the Steiner brothers, on this situation. But we see a union, the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers and Trainmen, who opposed video cameras in cabs, and they were arguing for the guidance system, which was clearly more expensive. So we have a private, entity that is lobbying the Congress, and certainly was successful in getting these California senators to sponsor this bill that was subsequently enacted by Congress that spent $1 gazillion installing this mandatory guidance system. Well, so we've had a chance to look at both how business influences government and why there is a public interest need for regulation by government of private enterprise. Certainly the most recent example that I think merits reconsideration is certainly 2008, the mortgage bubble brought to us by Wall Street, and Dodd-Frank, which was enacted by Congress to respond to the irrational exuberance, I guess we could call it, of Wall Street that just about collapsed the economy. I always like to recommend that students view that great movie, that HBO movie that you can view online, simply called Too Big to Fail. It's a great movie, and I think it is worth your time and will give you a lot of insight as to what actually occurred in 2008 that brought about increased governmental regulation of investment banks and hopefully has led to a non-repetition of the irresponsible behavior that was conducted by banks in those days. Too big to fail. Wow. Hopefully we will not see that again, but I think it makes a good argument for why we need government regulation. Well, boys and girls, as always, I invite your emails. Stay up with the syllabus. You got to be slavish following the syllabus. It's important that we stay on track. I want to hear from you regarding any technical or course-related questions that I can help you with. With that, as always, stay well. To be continued. Hooah!